Here we go! You're listening to Theological Discussions with Christian Anarchists.
Well, I've got nothing better to do.
He did not just say that.
One man, one mic, plenty of scripture, and absolutely no filter for truth.
He's a 5-point Calvinist who affirms theistic evolution. He reeks of being hellbound.
This guy shares more videos of James White than James White.
He's just another stupid Bible-thumping Matt Slick wannabe.
The views expressed on this show are solely those of the host and do not in its entirety express the views of the volunteering members of Spiritually Honest Ministries. Enjoy the podcast or get ready to send your hate comments.
Beginning broadcast in 3, 2, 1.
Alright, what's up everybody? This is the Christian Anarchist and you're tuning in to another episode of Theological Discussion. I am your host, not going to say the name again because I just said it earlier. Anyways, we are back with another program. This time we are having a interesting and special guest aboard the show. We have with us Negi Springfield, whereas one of the comments that I'd seen a while back had mentioned apparently has a name called, I guess, Paul Edomite's son, Negi Springfield. I don't know what's that all about. But regardless, just for the sake of a conversation, we'll just refer to as Negi for the conversation. As a member of a particular Hebrew Israelite camp that's been growing online by the name of the Torah Knights. So we'll see what happens and where the conversation leads. So Negi, thank you for joining us.
Yes, it's good to be here. But first thing I want to say, that's a little joke that me and this guy named Christian Velez have. He calls me Paul's Edomite son because one of the things that my group believes is that Paul, the Apostle Paul, was an Edomite or a white person. And there are evidence that Edomites were in Israel at the time. Some of them inappropriately became part of the priesthood, which is historical, but we're not really here to talk about that. But yeah, so you just go into what you want to talk about first. I'm your guest.
Right. So just to get started on one thing, so the one time I mentioned you by name was in, at least the first time I did, was in regards to a video that I responded to. I believe it was the last theological discussion that I did, and that was in which a statement that you had, in which you said that telling people to stop loving the white man, or to not love all white people, essentially. And so, of course, I had my problems with that. Do you want to add any comments to that? Because I did see that you did see it and commented on there a couple of times.
Yes, I'll clarify what I meant. I meant for people who are especially of so-called African American or Negro heritage, the love of the white man goes much deeper than just love for your fellow man. It's more like a slavish love, and that is not at all positive. Mm-hmm. It's not good for any people to be slavishly indebted or in love to people who essentially kidnapped and brought them over to a foreign land. So when I say stop loving the white man, I mean stop being slaves and start to think for yourself, because when you do that, then you're not looking up to someone. You are almost looking to them on equal terms.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, I mean, some of the people I know were named during the review of the particular video, such as Surreal, who I ended up debating a while back on limited atonement. Who was another one, Faithful to God. there was a couple people that are named G-Con is another one. Would you say that these are three people that fit that particular category?
I don't know enough about what they believe or what they teach, but for the most part, they do tend to get into debates with I guess you could say Israelites. And the thing that I kind of find strange is, why would they be? It's one thing if white people or certain ethnicities teach their own, but when you bring in the dynamic of history, and then you have problems, because sometimes you run into the nasty heritage that is slavery and the way that slaves were indoctrinated. So you almost have to take that into account when you think about issues like that. But the names that you just mentioned kind of come up fairly often. But where were you going with this?
Well, I was just asking because the way you're saying to stop loving them in a slavish way, would these be people that you would indicate there's would be supposedly loving white people in such a slavish way?
Well, some of them, in a way, the doctrine they preach is what I would imagine a person would teach if they wanted to give away a very McDonald's-esque kind of Christianity. Because there are segments of the Christian world that aren't exactly the same as the ones that the slaves were indoctrinated with. So it could be done in a way that isn't nearly as bad.
Okay, well, define McDonald-ish Christianity.
Your Baptist church, your
Well, Surreal most certainly is not that.
I think I know a little bit. He's Greek Orthodox, which kind of I find interesting, but I really don't have an issue with him.
I don't know exactly what the denomination is, but it's what I imagine was like a Mount Zion type of churches I normally have seen in the community.
But the main issue is that when you're dealing with people who know they're Hebrews, that's automatically going to create conflict, because Hebrews, at least the way they're supposed to be, is entirely for the one God who is named Yahweh. And you're not really going to see much in common with Christians unless you go to the camps, the actual camps, which Torah Knights is not really a camp. But the actual camps teach, like I said, that Baptist church mixed with the whole Hebrew idea, aesthetic. So it's almost like, in a way, you have different groups, but they all believe pretty much the same thing.
What, in regards to the Hebrew Israelite camp or the Christian?
Well, the ones that all basically agree on the whole, Jesus thing.
Okay.
There are different theologies. You're going to have Calvinists. You're going to have, people that think, different ways. But when they ultimately come together, they all agree on one thing, and that is that there's an Old and New Testament, things like that. So, so where do you want to go from there?
Well, I guess in regards to that, so let me just ask this. So, okay, not focus on specifically names. What would qualify as a slavish love? Like, what would someone have to do that qualifies it as that?
A slavish love is basically where you look up to a person without question because they're a white person, and when you don't think for yourself, when you essentially give your intellect over to someone else, that's slavish love. That's like cult-ish in a way.
Okay. Is there anyone that you can think of that would fit this particular category?
I can think of one. James White seems to be.
But he's not African or Hebrew.
No, he isn't, but he's an example of what I'm talking about when I say the white man. He does have he does debates to promote himself. I mean, I've seen some of his videos, and he does a slightly sloppy job at times, but it's like he wants to be taken seriously, and he wants people to listen to him, which isn't bad. It's just he gets more of a slave response out of people. I think it's the psychology.
I don't think so. I've seen how people have interacted with him on the different perspectives.
On the Hebrew side, the one that really comes to mind is General Yohana of the ISUPK. His whole manner is like a Baptist preacher. The other example is Brother Nathaniel from IUIC. He does the whole Baptist preacher thing to a hilt. So,
but they both have protested in a more extreme way of hatred for white people, and that's usually why they're in the at least in the Southern Law Poverty Center's group as a terrorist group, as a hate group.
They do seem to hate the white man, but their doctrines, when it comes down to it, are essentially the same, except for when it comes to who the Israelites are.
Right, but I mean, I'm just asking what kind of actions qualify the person as being slavish? In other words, what do they have to do if it's just simply showing this Baptist mentality?
It's not just Baptist mentality. It's like you have to, in a way, you almost remake yourself in the mental image of your enslaver. So in many of these black churches, you'll see the pastor do he'll almost be acting like a pimp. So his parishioners or the people in his church will be like the average, black people, and he'll be like the white guy up on stage, basically telling them to give him money and, just doing the whole spiel. And that's what slavery looks like. It's when you have a black man doing what maybe 100 years ago a white man would do. So I can't really support that.
So it's just specifically just certain actions.
It's like a whole mentality. It's a whole,
So what makes the Baptist mentality exclusively only for whites at that point? Like what makes it something that's uniquely white? Or because I'm a Southern Baptist, and
what makes it uniquely white is going back to the history of where this stuff came, how this was used. I guess you could say, because you see, when they brought slaves over, they didn't really care who they really were. They wanted to wipe out any memory they had of where they came from. So they many times would baptize these slaves into the Catholic Church, which the Catholic Church is the #1 denomination, and it's the mother church of almost every single other that has ever, existed. So
not involved in things like the Baptist Church and all those others.
No. But the mentality goes back to the Catholics, because they were the ones that really started it with the Jesuits and the other infiltrating movements. So this is something much bigger.
Okay. All right, so I still don't understand what you mean then by the Baptist.
Well, that's just the Southern. That's the biggest Southern denomination, and
what does the pastor have to be doing that is considered this? You said that.
It's rather easy. They're squeezing money out of his flock.
Okay.
Giving them bad doctrine. It just goes on and on.
There's only one Southern Baptist that I know that does that. A guy by the name of Furtick or something like that, and he's considered a heretic by a majority of the Southern Baptist Convention due to the fact that he is a prosperity gospel preacher. He waters down on the Bible, and that people like my pastor and others would be very disgusted and disappointed and would kick him out of the church immediately. But he's going off his own thing ever since he decided to try to take that particular label and push it on to himself as Southern Baptist. But as a person who attends a Southern Baptist church, the pastor does not ask or swindle people out for money. They pass the plate around, but there's times we had no money in that collection plate, and we don't care because the pastor still has a day job, and that's how he is basically affording not just his place, but also the church, which is a rundown place that has gone through many disasters, including being flooded. So we've had to do with what we can, and we don't try to build or make it much bigger. So, I mean, I don't see where then this idea of swindling money comes
admirable, but the thing is, I'm just picking on them for no reason, but it's really, when you boil it down and you look underneath, every nook and cranny, you find Freemasonry at the heart of it. And Freemasonry is what really is the poison of, I guess you could say the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Christianity, because they're the ones that tolerate it for the most part.
Well, I don't see what we would have in common with the Freemasons, since Southern Baptists reject this idea of universalism and universal truth from different various religions and sects. We reject that as Southern Baptists.
Well, the funny thing is, in spite of that, they wouldn't have very many members if they kicked out the Masons. And the reason they can even tolerate Masons in their ranks is because of that fact, because they know they wouldn't have anyone if they kicked them out. But they don't have to agree with Freemasonry, because Freemasonry ultimately is it's an imitation church, but many people join it because it basically gives them connections. But what it is it's not a good thing, because when we're talking about white people or Edomites, then that's the Edomites' version of the temple. So the Edomites' own temple is corrupt, because we know for a fact the Masons have been behind a ton of crimes. They molest children. They do a whole bunch of other nasty stuff. So,
and that's their problem, not ours as Southern Baptist. Not mine as my church.
No, not. I'm not even. Once again, I'm not picking on Southern Baptists. It's the whole. When you're looking at it from the perspective of how white people have treated the so-called Negro, it's almost like you have to look at the whole spectrum of like Christianity as a brainwashing tool, because that's what it was used as. It was used to make these people more willing to follow the white man. So,
can you show me a passage within the New Testament that indicates follow the white man as a doctrinal teaching passage?
Romans 13.
Romans 13 is in regards to government, and the passage context in regards to that is to let every soul be citizens unto the higher powers and the governing authorities, for there's no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Not saying to just blindly submit to them.
Even though it doesn't say specifically to blind, it's been used in a way that does allow for, I guess you could say, people to be more blindly obedient.
Not really. I mean, when we've taken a look at what this happened in the early Christian church, in fact, the early Christian church played a interesting, huge role in trying to free slaves. by sometimes the church members selling their own bodies into slavery so that they may free slaves to play the same form of sacrificial role that they've seen Christ play. They apply by going to these different these places and giving them their own bodies over so that people may be liberated from the tortured establishment of slavery.
Then it's a bit strange that that many years later it would be used to justify keeping people in slavery.
Right, and this is what we call the abuse of Scripture, and that people would abuse and twist the words. Things can be taken out of context once several hundred years have passed. Just like if you write something now, and then you die, then come like 1,200 years later, if a Negi scholar over in Europe was to examine your work, would you have wanted him to hopefully take into consideration the context of which you were alive at and the language in which you were writing about?
Yes, I would, but in some ways you can't really control what people do.
Right, and that's what I agree. And so these people, we could control them. They were left to their own wicked, depraved thoughts, and they sought to pervert the Scriptures for their own needs. The Old and New Testament speaks that people will do this because that is what people at natural are.
Yes, I agree with you. I just sometimes when I'm looking at something from a historical perspective, I just see things differently. And I mean, I'm not really asking you to agree with me on that. I just it's one thing when I'm talking to people who understand where I'm coming from, because a lot of these people are more than willing to believe me. So when I'm talking to people who are in the Torah, usually they weren't born in the Torah. They had to come find it, and they had to go through a whole lot of, theological minefields to get there. So many people are coming from different backgrounds. Some of them are Lutherans, and some of them are even Mormons. So not one model fits, but one of the things that works is when you can bring people back to, like, for example, if they read the Old Testament when they were a Christian or a Mormon, then they're going to be able to understand it, but then you got to build on that. So in many cases, it's not talking about what you don't believe, it's talking about what you believe now. So that's that's the place I want to bring people to.
Okay. All right, so you did mention that you focused on things from a historical point, and hopefully you can answer this particular question that I found interesting from Judah Natzar and a couple other guys. Because especially in regards to one of the videos, I believe it was actually the first one that I did. Some right here from Tretel Azaria Thomas says Christianity sounds threatened. TK don't hate Edomites, hence one in the camp. This is slander at its finest, but they wouldn't expect less from a Jesus penis worshiper. This is what the Tretel has mentioned, and then of course you have Judah Natzar, who I've seen at multiple times keep bringing this up, that originally Christianity started out as a penis worshipping cult. Do you see any justification that backs up the claims from a historical standpoint?
Well, that's a very crude way to put it, but the way I would put it is some branches of Christianity have more elements of what we would call, in less childish terms, phallic worship, which means male.
Can you name one?
Yes, but I'm just going to get to that in a minute. But phallic worship is the worship of male gods, and essentially, in some cases, the actual form and shape of the male generative organ. So when you look at, and some people take this to an extreme that I can't really back, but one of the things that does seem to come out is the Osiris connection, because Osiris was a male god who died, was buried, and the mythological details don't matter too much. He came back to life. The Egyptians believed because he came back to life, they too would come back to life if they were buried in a similar manner that he was. And this cult was essentially not just part of Egypt, part of all over the world. Like you see it in India, you see it in Mexico, you see it in South America, and you see it in even some parts of Europe. But what it is it's essentially the same. It's the phallus that dies is, rises again, and that's the whole, that's what makes it a phallic cult. But what you could argue is that because Christianity believes that one day Jesus will sit on the throne and rule over the world, that it isn't focused only on that. But the thing is, most of the people who are talking about Christianity are talking about a dying and rising God, and don't focus on the one that they pay lip service to as one day ruling, which is a disservice in my mind to Christianity.
Okay, so when you say phallic worship, it doesn't actually refer to specifically the penis.
It's worshiping a male god in essence. So,
okay, because when I've seen they mention it, they don't just simply say phallic worship or just worship the male. They literally say, I've heard.
I know. Yes, I can explain that. I can tell you where that comes from. There's a crucifix that kind of shows Jesus' abs in a way that looks almost like a penis sticking out.
Okay.
And it's a very puerile thing. Before I knew Judah Netzora, I used to go on a website called 4chan, and I saw an image where they point out that it kind of looks like a penis, and I thought that was kind of silly. I find it hard to believe that a grown man can
Okay, so when was this particular symbol written down?
When was it painted? I don't know. Someone painted the crucifix in that way. I don't think it was intentional, but I think subconsciously things can come out sometimes. But I'm not going to argue that it's a penis worship cult thing.
Okay. So you would disagree with what Judah Netzora is?
I'm not saying I disagree. I'm just saying I think there's a way to look at it that isn't nearly as immature, and I'm just saying that's the way I feel. I think it's immaturely seen. I think we can talk about it like adults. I mean, I think that's a fair statement,
Right. Because at some point I'm gonna get Judah on the on this show at some time in the near future. I just need to figure out what schedule I can.
He's in Japan, so that means he's at least a day ahead of you. So you can I can look that up right now and tell you exactly what, because I have it on my clock thing.
No, I'll figure it out from there. At least I'll know he's in Japan.
It's 9:43 where he is in the morning. So.
All right. Okay, so. Okay, 9:43. All right, I'll figure that one out. All right. So that being said, so just to clarify, you don't believe it's about that there was any. Let me just ask this. Do you believe that early Christians worshipped Jesus's penis?
No, I believe early Christians, at least the one, if we're talking before they were actually called Christians. I believe many of them followed a teacher of righteousness who they called Jesus or Yahweh,
Mm-hmm.
because the Hebrew is funky. People give it weird vowel sounds, but the name is at least Yahweh or something similar.
Right.
They believed in a person who taught the Torah in a very extensive way, and they probably believed he was like a second Elijah. So, in many cases, the characteristics we see today, or characteristics that go back 100 years, were not present, because that came out of an Edomite thing. That was an Edomite Greek Roman cult. You see, because they had this thing called the imperial cult. And to be taken seriously as a religion, you almost had to have a God-man thing. So that's where they took this humble rabbi character or humble teacher character, and they gave him some of the characteristics of an imperial God. So you definitely have to split some hairs when you're talking about early Christianity because of that alone.
Okay. All right. So, one of the things that I've also have looked at is that while y'all seem to depict, because that's the one thing I don't understand, is that there are times, and in fact, even in one of my off-air conversations with Judah, and I think you were there for a brief second or minute, I forget how long you were able to stay there for. You said this Yahashua or Jesus person is different than the one we believe, because you believe he was simply just a Torah teacher of a Levite sect, and that's all he was. My question then becomes, where do we get this?
Oh, where that would come from is the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Dead Sea Scrolls were a collection of prophetic books, but they were also writings of the people who made them. So these people are called
So
the
you're talking about
Essenes.
so wait, hold on. You're talking about a Jesus that is predating the AD period that's in BC?
Well, the time that these were written, they were regarding a teacher of righteousness, and we have some of the characteristics of him, and we have some of the characteristics of Yahweh, and they have a similarity, even if they were from different time periods. We can kind of ascertain a real person.
Okay. All right.
So it's fairly it's like recreating a person from a skeleton, but it's not impossible.
Okay. That's the one part I haven't been able to understand, is we all get this particular idea of a Levite tribe.
Well, it wasn't exactly like that. They were called Zadoks or righteous ones, and what they really were all about is they weren't priests like sons of Aaron, but they were priests like they were able to minister in the temple when there still was a temple. And the most famous of them is named James, because he was called James the Just or James the Righteous, which is Zadok. And this is one of the most well-known of the Zadoks. So when you read about him, you really get an interesting picture of a man, someone who wasn't your average person. He basically was as good as people can get. So it wasn't a tribe or anything. It was people who were called to a unique level of holiness.
Mm-hmm. All right. Okay, so that's the... All right. All right, so my next question is why did you specifically decide to follow the Torah Knight group out of the other different sects that are out there?
Well, because Judah impressed me the most. I saw his videos early on, and my first impression wasn't very good, but with time I saw more, and I saw that he had depth of knowledge that I could respect quite a bit, because one of the things about me is that I'm something of an occultist. I'm a strange fit for the group, because one of the first things that I used to like was Aleister Crowley and his writings. So when I found Torah Knights, I found an esoteric group that also was into the Torah, and it intrigued me quite a bit. So that's why.
Esoteric?
Esoteric means it's like advanced, but it also means something that has to be understood in different levels or layers.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, all right, that being said, trying to figure out, well, because I want to make sure to get as much questions I can get out of this before we have to wrap up. And I mean, I'm just trying to figure out mostly why also, I guess I mean why as well on this show, why Torah Knights over Christianity then, I guess.
Well, one of the things that I'm not completely writing off is quote unquote Christianity, because I just don't agree with the way most people do it. I believe that in many cases there are flaws with the beliefs that people have. Like, for example, people don't look to the future. They don't look to the future kingdom that, if you read the New Testament, that Jesus will establish. So if they claim to believe in the New Testament, then that means they should be looking forward to the future. But many people are looking behind them almost. So,
like, define behind them.
Well, they see in most churches, you go and they do the whole, they eat the bread and they drink the grape juice or the wine or whatever. And what that is that's, if you read one of Paul's writings where he says you proclaim the Lord's death until he returns, then that is on one level a proclamation, but on the other level, what it is it's essentially making it to where that most people aren't looking forward. They're still looking at the old way of understanding, Jesus, when there's a theology that gets completely ignored. I think mostly because at that time the Torah will actually come out and be made the number one, ideology. So people ignore it more.
Okay, so the issue is people not going back to the Torah and such?
Yes, or they disregard it, or they
they'll define disregard it, because I actually preached a sermon at one of the churches, at the church I'm at, and the sermon was completely based off of the entire book of Jonah. So I've had times where I have gone to the Tanakh and especially the Torah for the sermon messages that at least I have preached upon, as well as what my pastor has preached upon.
In that case, I can't really say you're part of the problem. I can say you're part of the solution. But what's interesting about is that most people don't do that. That's you're rare. You're a rare.
Well, it depends on how you define most people. If you include Roman Catholics within this particular sect, you'd be right, because these are apostates that have forsaken the Bible. They have forsaken Christ. That is what Catholicism stands for.
Yes. They've essentially disregarded their own rules. But
right.
The way I see it is many people have had the experience where they go to church and many times they don't hear anything from the Old Testament, as it's called. They hear nothing but the New Testament. They're hearing Paul's writings exclusively, which I think is a bit of a disservice. If they're going to a church and they're not hearing the whole Bible, if that's what the church claims they believe in,
I don't know of any church that would go for exclusively what Paul says. If anything, I see churches that try to go exclusively to just Jesus alone, and they'll say that Paul is a racist, homophobic, misogynist, and all that stuff, and that Jesus was a universalist. I mean,
is this okay.
Yeah.
I just once again, it's not my experience, it's what other people have said, so I can't really comment on it. But it's interesting that you did touch on Jonah, who's I don't know if you've ever heard you know the word parable, but the word originally was mashal. A person can be a mashal, a nation can be a mashal, or it can just be an allegorical picture of something. But Jonah is quite an interesting one. But I find that pleasantly surprising.
Right. So, but here's the thing that I'm finding interesting is that you keep then going on to these people's experiences with Christianity and such, and I don't think we should judge what Christianity teaches based upon a few people that claim to adhere to the particular religion. It's like David Wood once said in his debate on his Islam, a Religion of Peace, and that is that it would be irrelevant if a majority of the Muslims in the world were violent people trying to kill in jihad, or if a majority of the Muslims around the world were peaceful people proclaiming love and all that. It still wouldn't change what happened about 1400 years ago and what the Quran and the Hadith report. So likewise, that if all kinds of Christians are just mean, and that's the majority, that doesn't change what the New Testament states. Just likewise also, that if you have a bunch of people that are claiming to follow the Torah and claiming to be Torah Knights, but at the same time they say, well, it's not important to keep Sabbath, would that then be, well, then that it means that the Torah Knight religion includes the practice of disobeying the Sabbath? Would that be something logically that follows, or would it be no, that it's they are actually misrepresenting and don't accurately understand the own religion they claim to be a part of?
Well, it's interesting you bring that up, because one of the things we've had people that say things that don't represent us, and I can completely understand where you're coming from. And we should not represent a certain religion by what a few do, that's why I don't do that usually. I just, sometimes in looking for examples, I have to go outside of my usual, my usual is looking historically. So I look at things that you can actually say, this happened once upon a time, and it had an impact across the board from that time to the present. And in some ways, the Protestant Reformation is one of those things.
So then what about the gospel accounts?
The gospel accounts have a lot of truth in them. When they talk about the times and the place That, when they're talking about a specific time and a specific place, they usually get it right. I mean, that's something I can give them without any question.
Mm-hmm. So then, in regards to that, these gospel accounts do seem to record from 4 different accounts, one being written from a historian perspective by gathering multiple eyewitness accounts, and the other receiving oral tradition from Peter. You have, and the other 2 being the actual eyewitnesses, which is in Matthew, and then you have the other being in John. You have all these 4 gospels, and they seem to harmonize with ultimately that you have Jesus coming, proclaiming the message. He is crucified on the cross, which that is a fact that's even proclaimed by people that weren't Christians, and that were people such as Josephus and Tacitus, one being the 1st century document, the other being the 2nd century document. Then you have people like, what's his name? The particular event being the resurrection, which the Gospels themselves still count as historical accounts, to even the point where people like, even though he argues inconsistently, that Bart Ehrman argues that the Gospels are still a eyewitness account, and that even the epistles still also likewise counted to these eyewitness accounts, but that, of course, he has his own liberal theories about how should we approach them. But the point is that even then still, Christian secular scholars and historians are able to look at these documents and see them not just simply as theological alone, but the fact that these are historical eyewitness documents from 2 people that were directly there. One person who gathered his account upon the testimony of several eyewitnesses, and one receiving oral tradition from someone who was there, meaning Mark got his oral tradition from Peter. So then wouldn't that convict you to take into consideration about not just the crucifixion, but the resurrection of Jesus?
Well, one of the things that gets lost in discussion is the role. I'm glad you brought this guy up, because he's very interesting. Josephus was actually he was a person who lived in the land at the time. But what happened is he became a historian for the Roman Empire.
Mm-hmm.
And what he did is he wrote the version that they wanted. They were so proud of what he wrote that they actually gave him a name. They actually adopted him into the family that the Flavian dynasty. They adopted him into that dynasty, and they were quite wealthy. So it wasn't like they were just doing it. They weren't nobody. This was someone prominent, someone important. And what's very fascinating is they also had something to do with helping to bring about the imperial cult Christianity into place, even when the empire was dwindling. So it's going to be very hard for me to say that anything that the guy wrote was trustworthy, because he was almost acting as an agent for the Romans.
Okay. Do you have any source or citation for this?
I could get them. I mean, I just don't have them on hand at the moment.
I mean, can you think of any off the top of your head, just at least of a title of a book that goes into this?
I mean, let me just try to find something real quick. I know there are books written about this.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So while
here it is, Josephus' account of Jesus, the Testimonium Flavianum. There's other books.
Well, who's the author of this particular book?
I'm looking here. All right. Yeah, the author Alice Wheatley.
Oh, it's Willie?
Mm-hmm.
Haven't heard of that
Oh,
one.
Antiquities of the Jews. There's a
Oh, these are
Judea.
these are his actual works.
There's like a book called something like Judea grumbles under Rome or something. I can't remember. The works of Flavius Josephus.
Okay.
There's a whole bunch. There's even sources that question the authenticity of what the man wrote, because the man was writing for people who would have benefited very much from a twisted interpretation of how things went.
Okay. So he was simply a person that was trying to provide a perspective on Jewish history in regards to what would fit more with what the Romans were saying.
He made it look like they weren't as brutal or as I guess you could say as bad as they were.
Okay. And one of the works we see, this is in Antiquities of the Jews.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Have you read the preface to Antiquities of the Jews?
No, but I've heard other people and their findings on it.
Right. Because I've argued with other people involved in Josephus and Antiquities of the Jews, and I've had interesting liberal scholarship approaches towards it, no matter how many times you keep pointing certain things out. So I just want to get your take on this particular thing. So you have the preface in which he gives out the motivation for writing this particular work, and that is, quote, "Now I have undertaken the present work as thinking it will appear to all the Greeks worthy of their study, for it will contain all our antiquities and the constitution of our government as interpreted out of the Hebrew scriptures." Of which Josephus scholar, and he was one of the leading scholars on Josephus before his death, Louis Feldman, highlights several of the misconceptions about the Jewish people that were being circulated in Josephus' time. In particular, the Jews were thought to lack great historical figures and a credible history of their people. They were also accused of harboring hostility toward non-Jews and were thought to be generally lacking in loyalty, respect for authority, and charity. This is found in Louis Feldman's work known as Josephus's Interpretation of the Bible, which was published in 1998. Pages 132 through 162 is where the information for this is found.
Well, if we're talking about Judaism, then we're talking about an Edomite religion, which grew up next to Christianity. But what's interesting is the Hebrews were nothing like that. What they were was they had no problems with non-Hebrews. They, in fact, in their own Torah, are told to treat the stranger as one of their own. So even if you were a pagan and you were, in Israel for a brief time, you were treated with in every way almost the same as anyone else. So there wasn't really any hostility.
So back then, that's originally how the Hebrews behaved, is that there was no hostility.
There was no hostility, and if there was, it was contrary to the commandments of the Torah.
Okay, so if that's the case, I have seen there have been moments where, for example, there was a discussion with Vocab Malone, which that's the one thing I noticed that you definitely were being calm and patient in your discourse with him, but everyone else, especially Judah of Nazareth, even got to the point where he seemed to be making a mocking tone and grabbed, I don't know what book he reads concerning the Bible, because I don't know what particular copy he has, but he then proceeded to put it on his rear end and started acting and wiping with it.
I know what copy that was. That's a Hebrew English New Testament, and that was kind of funny-ish. I know that's disrespectful. I would never encourage that behavior at all, but I'm just saying.
But would you say that this is what you were saying earlier, that this would be kind of violating what the ancient Hebrews would do?
Well, the ancient Hebrews would certainly have not done that, as far as I can tell. The ancient Hebrews would have carried themselves with a bit more dignity, but I think Judah just wanted to tick him off. He wanted him to leave. And
is that something that would be permitted within the Torah, though?
No, not at all. I don't believe that would have been allowed, but I'm not here to criticize. I mean, Judah's not the leader. He's a very visible head, but he's not a leader. I
can say specific leader, because it seems that every time somebody makes content, it does seem to go on his channel. I've seen where Lamad, another individual, has taken his content. He has his own content where he talks about or it says Vocab Malone denies Jesus 3 times, and then I find it's also on Judah's channel with the same exact title. That's why I made the assumption that he.
Yes, what I said is it's very visible head, which means he's the one that people will see. But in terms of leader, like giving orders, that isn't the way it is at all.
Okay. So there's no leader figure.
There is no leader figure, because that is the way that's the way One West groups do it. That's how other cultish organizations do it. So we don't do it that way.
Right. Curious question, because I hear that the Israelite, the Torah Knights do talk about a gospel. What is the gospel according to Torah Knights?
The gospel, when you're talking about something other than the Evangelion, which is the Greek language dominant gospel, the other one would be what's called the Bashar, which means like flesh. And what it is it's living flesh over dead bones. It brings people back to life, and it's more of a concept than an actual book. But it's found in if you know the Valley of the Dry Bones in Ezekiel. That's an allegory that essentially teaches you that you can be born again. It's probably the first original reborn concept, but in that context, it talks about Israel going from death, which is like paganism, to life, which is like found in the Torah. So that's the original true gospel.
Okay. Right. All right. So the gospel is something you only find in the Torah.
No. One of the things that I've found in my research is that someone actually wrote an expounded explanation of the Bashar, and we don't have that. I don't have that text on hand, but it's actually work. It's a work that expounds on the allegory found in Ezekiel. So that would be the other gospel.
And where's this from?
It's I think the people who were the keepers of it were called the Mandaeans, which were the original Gnostics.
Yeah. The Gnostics.
And they weren't the Gnostics that you're probably thinking of. They were purely about searching after knowledge, and they believed that particular spiritual knowledge would enable one to understand the Bashar. Only they called it the Bashir.
Okay. All right. Because I saw someone had wanted to hear, in your words, what is the gospel. So I figured that might help out on that. Okay, so concerning the Torah, and in fact the other rest of the Old Testament, do you? Because I've seen that people have been able to make the correlation, and there's books and all that kind of stuff written about prophecies fulfilled in the messiahship of Jesus. Do you not see those parallels, or is there something else to it?
Well, you have to understand what Messiah means in Hebrew. In Hebrew, it means Mashiach, or the word is Mashiach, and what it means is it means an anointed one, but it also means someone who is devoted to something. So in the context of the Torah, Mashiach would be someone devoted to the Torah, someone who is devoted to Yahweh. So Messiah does not necessarily imply divinity, although in the Psalms it says that man is a little lower than an angel. So he's like a small power, a small Elohim. So the way it works is one of the other Mashiachs in the Torah is the high priest. He goes into the Holy of Holies not as a mere man, but he goes almost as a small kind of God to do the work in front of the ark, to put the blood on, do the whole thing. And what that enables him to do is go in there without fear of dying. So he's not like he's not the same thing as what you're probably thinking when you say Messiah. Messiah is just someone who is authorized in a special way and also devoted to whatever it is.
All right. All right. So, how do you then? All right. So, do you believe God is a Unitarian in the Torah?
He's one. Yes.
Okay. Well, I mean, we agree that he is one, but the question is, do you believe he's a Unitarian?
Does he have the characteristics which the word in Hebrew, akkad, implies? Yes, he does.
Well, I mean, again, I agree that he has those same characteristics of applying of the akkad, but even then, there's the Unitarian, the Binitarian, and the Trinitarian, and the other different Jewish thoughts that were over this interpretation that still apply to the akkad, while still taking the rest of the knock into account.
I do know some of the things that you're referring to. One of them was that just like how man has three parts to his being, so does God, or so does Yahweh in a sense. I couldn't tell you which ones I think have the most legitimacy, but what we do know is that Yahweh is spirit, and he's each of the letters in his name are different elements. So we can't really say whether or not he has a body or how many parts he has, but one thing is for certain is that he's not like every part of him is integral. So it's all, they all are fused together as one. So
Right.
you can't really pray to one part and think that that's going to be answered.
Right. But what if the roles are basically the one God and such, and that they serve their own purpose and such as, say, for Trinitarian position, the Father is the main head honcho. When we address him in prayer, that's who we address. We don't say, "Dear Jesus" or "Dear Holy Spirit." We say, "Heavenly Father." We address the Father because that's how Jesus tells us to do so, is that it's the Father's will that is important, not the Son, but the Father's will in regards to especially what goes on during prayer. And that's the model for prayer that has happened from the Old Testament to the New. There are some passages I do want to get to in regards to what I find to be some interesting verses that deal with there being this figure that I again refer to as the second the second power in heaven, or at least what would be considered the Old Testament Jesus. And in fact, there's actually an interesting manga that came out about that displays this in a interesting light.
Oh, do tell. I'm actually interested in that. What
Yeah, there's they call it it's called the manga Bible series. It started off with Manga Messiah, and then they started going up to the different past different ones.
Oh, okay. I'll give that a look. But
it's in Manga Mutiny is where it starts with Genesis, and it ends with the escape from Egypt in Exodus. Is in this particular volume, and that's where you see especially the concepts of the second power in heaven, because it's definitely all over within Genesis, at least in two places. One where Abraham meets these two men in Genesis 18. And it says, "And the Lord appeared unto him in the plains of Mamre, and he sat in the tent door in the heat of the day. And he lifts up his eyes and looked, and lo, 3 men stood by him. And when he saw them, he ran to meet them from the door, and bowed himself before the ground, and said, My Lord, if now I have found favor in thy sight, pass not away, I pray thee, from thy servant." So those 3 verses that we see, especially in the first verse, it uses the sacred name for God, and it says that the Lord appeared unto him in the plains of Mamre, and he sat in the tent door in the heat of day. And we see this context in which the Lord has made a physical appearance, even to the point of which he travels to with Abraham, where they look towards Sodom, and the Lord is telling him of what the fate of Sodom is, and they're having this dialogue back and forth. So what do you think of that particular instant?
One thing that I can fall back on with some certainty is that in many instances it is said that Yahweh is in a place, but what in reality is true is that it's not him literally. He is too great, too awesome, too powerful to be in one place alone. Because if you read the dedication prayer that Solomon makes after he built the temple and he's dedicating it to Yahweh, he says that that it is too small for him, that no temple built could contain him. So I find it very difficult. We have to understand what you just brought up in a different light. It can't be him in all his power and majesty. It has to be something like a representative. Like if I was talking to you over the phone, then it would be like the phone or like what we're doing right now. Like, for example, you're looking at this picture that isn't me, but you're hearing my voice. So I can only imagine that the God of the universe doing something like that, like what he did with Moses through the burning bush. Because it says Yahweh was in the bush, but we know it was an angel in the bush.
Right. And that's why there's a different context to keep in mind, because again, the term, and for example, one of the popular words that indicates this is such as the angel of the Lord. And while angel itself can simply just imply messenger, one of the other ideas is that it just simply means messenger, but God, Yahweh himself, can still be a messenger. And that's why one of the theories that was purported around the time that wasn't considered heretical until long after Christianity had been an established religion was the idea of this binitarian second power in heaven view. And this has been noted by people said that by Jewish scholars by the name of Alan Siegel, Daniel Boyarin, and Dr. Benjamin Sommer in their work, in which they examine not just the Old Testament, but also the rabbinical traditions, the Aramaic Targums, and all these others. And he comes to find out that there are these different ideas in such where even forgot, like the Kabbalah, for example, is sort of treated in this same kind of a sense, I believe, like this idea of these different aspects and such. And this is something that Benjamin Sommer notes in his work, The Bodies of God and the World of Ancient Israel. So there are times where we see that this figure is portrayed in a way that only can be attributed to Yahweh. Elsewise, you're going to have to say you're committing blasphemy at that point, because if you look where it says the angel of Yahweh said this, then there's parts where it says, then Yahweh said to this person, not just simply being a mouthpiece, but as if the person spoke directly to him.
Well, one of the things that when you said two powers in heaven, all I could think of was Enoch, where that was exclaimed by I think it was the person who is being taken up into heaven. He sees two people sitting side by side, and he exclaims that. And if you've ever read that, then you know that the one angel was taken and he was given beatings to show that he was not, in fact, a second power in heaven. And that's called the pulsa dinura, which is the lashes of fire. So that's the first thing that comes to my mind. But I have no clue about that, so I don't know enough. The concept sounds like it was created out of a philosophical understanding, which isn't bad, at least from my perspective. But like most mysticism, you have to understand it symbolically. Otherwise,
Well, he said this wasn't simply a philosophical thing. Like, this is like, he said that most of his information didn't just come from like different like philosophers and such. It was simply going to what were considered authoritative sources, which is not just the Tanakh, but the Aramaic Targums, the rabbinical literature, and even the Talmud.
Well, I can't really comment on that because my experience is limited in that regard. I do know a little bit about Kabbalah, but only as far as a magician would understand.
All right. Then I'll, whenever this we get done with the program, I'll send you the PDF to Alan Siegel's book on this, which has been considered the what at least some of them, if they try to go off of this in modern research, they base their work off of his, since his was a definitive version. And then a lecture from Daniel Boyarin, who goes into quoting from the Targums and such about this particular matter, about the two powers in heaven, or the this figure that would be considered by some as the Old Testament Jesus, if some people wanted to give it another name besides the two powers in heaven and such.
Okay, that sounds interesting. I'll give it a look. Thank you.
All right. No problemo. All right, so then I don't want to discuss that because I want to be fair and not try to just discuss an issue, but at least I do want to bring up one thing, at least, just concerning the Tanakh, and that is in Genesis chapter 32, in which Jacob was left alone, and there wrestled a man with him with the breaking of the day. And when he saw that, he prevailed not against him. He touched the hollow of his thigh, and the hollow of Jacob's thigh was out of joint. And he wrestled with him, and they kept going. And he said, "Let me go, for the day breaketh." And he said, "I will not let thee go, except thou bless me." He said, "What is thy name?" He says, "Jacob." And he says, "Thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel, for as a prince hast thou power with God and with men, and hast prevailed." And Jacob asked him and said, "Tell me, I pray thee, thy name." And he said, "Wherefore is it that thou dost ask after my name?" And he blessed him there. And then Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. This is one of the things where Jacob was in amazement, in which he recognized that he was able to see Elohim face to face, God face to face, but yet his life is preserved, and he recognized, the one Torah statement that says, if you look upon the Lord, then you shall surely die, because of how glorious and holy his majesty is, that it be that unbearable for someone to just simply look and take in all of that. We see the same kind of thing, that even though he didn't look, Moses had a glimmer of the holiness of God glimmering onto him that even scared some of the Israelites he brought out of Egypt.
Mm-hmm. And if you remember, one of the things that's kind of funny about that is that Latin translators translated the Hebrew for beams of light as horns. So Michelangelo actually depicted him with horns, mm-hmm, to not piss off the Catholic Church.
Right.
Anyway, yeah, he wrestled with God, which, if you know Hebrew, is El. And what's interesting is that's kind of specific. That's kind of like specific in its generality. Like, for example, things are called El that aren't really, it's applied to other things besides, other beings besides Yahweh. So he could have wrestled with an angel. I mean, he could have wrestled with a lesser power, but I don't believe he wrestled with the creator of the universe.
Mm-hmm. Right. But couldn't the power have been this second power that still bear the same name as God, but it wasn't the part that we hear about, that is, like, it's not the same exact one that was what's talking to Moses on Mount Sinai, but rather it is the different concepts, such as the second power, that was able to actually be there in the physical form and have this kind of conversation, to the point of getting Jacob to be convinced in his mind that he wrestled with God. And that's why he named it, especially in light of that paragraph in context.
Well, the way I see it is, I don't know if you've ever heard of the Rosicrucians.
Mm-mm.
They're like a mystical group that believes that their founder, whose name was Christian Rosencreuz, essentially went from the east to the west, and he learned all kinds of arcane and esoteric knowledge, and he was buried, and they believed his tomb became like a vault for the adepts, which is essentially similar to what the Masons believe about Hiram Abiff. But from one perspective, you could argue, like they do, that both are one and the same person, and essentially that this is the same thing you could say about a second power, you could also ascribe to this person. So I kind of see it as being allegorical. So in any way, the best way you can see anything like this is as an allegory first, and then if there is a spiritual reality to it, then you have to look at that second, if you understand what I mean.
Mm-hmm. All right. All right, so we only got time for, one more thing before we decide to dismiss the show. And that is, so let me just ask you this, I guess, then, to make the table seem to be turned. When it comes to, if there was a challenge that you would prefer, what would it take to convince you to become a Christian and not a Torah Knight guy? Just giving something out there that meets to your satisfactions on that, and not based upon trying to accommodate to us, but based upon your what your needs are in regards to that. What would it take to convince you of Christianity over Torah Knights?
I'm gonna put that in a way that kind of makes sense to me. But what you're saying is, what would make me, what would convince me of the truth of the gospel as understood by Christians, I guess.
Okay.
If you could show me that believing in Jesus is not Edomite creation, if you could show me that it actually has legitimate Hebrew roots, because I've been over this so many times, and it's kind of strange. People will go to certain prophetic books. They'll go to Isaiah 58, and they'll jump over to other chapters in Isaiah. But what's weird is, in most of the cases, they say, this is about Israel, this is about Israel, and then they'll get to one, and then that's specifically talking about Jesus. So my thing would be, all right, explain why. And that's all I need to hear. I mean, I just need to hear them say why they, I want to hear them back up their reasoning. Although I've heard it, I've never heard anyone give that to my satisfaction. Also, they're going to have to explain how a dying and resurrecting God is indeed still true, even though we've seen it all over the world. And how can the pagans who have no knowledge of God whatsoever, how can they get that right? So that's it, really.
All right, then. Well, then, hopefully you benefited from this conversation as much as I have, so hopefully we keep in touch. This was very decent. Definitely went a lot better than I expected. Very reasonable, very peaceful. There was no yelling. There was no real argumenting. So thank you for coming on. And
it was good. It was good to be here, and I'm more than willing to deal with you in the future. So
sure thing, no problemo. But that is all the time we have on Theological Discussion, ladies and gentlemen. So thank y'all for tuning in. We'll try to see if we can maybe do a continuation on the Torah Knights going to the other members, because I did see also this right before we went on, Chris Harris had possibly might wanted to be on to do a little continuation, because I remember he was certainly an interesting individual when we talked.
Yes.
So we'll see how that how that turns out. But until then, this has been the Christian Anarchist. Shalom Aleichem, peace be upon you, because I wish that upon you.
Uh-huh.
Good day.